Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Francophile Reader. So today I am doing a book tag, and that's the top 10 nonfictions book tag created by Lukasz at Totally Pretentious. Instead of talking about my top 10 favorite works of nonfiction, I thought I'd narrow it down to 5, and these are my 5 absolute favorite works of nonfiction. I decided to follow the rules. There are 3 rules, but the one that I decided I would follow, even though I could have included books under this category on the list, was the one where we can't include religious texts, because I could have included Augustine's Confessions, but I thought, well, while it's not, the Bible, at the same time, it is a spiritual work. It is intended to be a spiritual work, so I decided not to include it, but it's an honorable mention, and I do think that Augustine's Confessions is an incredible work. But yeah, these are my 5 favorite books. These are in no particular order. Let's begin. Number 1, The Biography of Augustine of Hippo by Peter Brown. So while I am not including any of Augustine's writings, I am including a biography that I think is one of the best biographies that has been written in the past century. This was published in the late 1960s by Peter Brown, who is this great scholar of late antiquity. His biography of Augustine is the one that I would recommend to everyone because it was so engrossing and so atmospheric that I actually went and read City of God in its entirety. City of God is Augustine's largest work. It's over 1,000 pages, and it's tedious. I would never have picked it up if it weren't for Peter Brown's really fascinating analysis of City of God in one of the sections of his biography. Several times while reading this book, I felt like I was standing in the cathedral in Hippo Regius, listening to Augustine preach. He's such a complicated figure, and what this work did was summarize a scholarship about Augustine through the late 60s. Now, of course, there has been a lot of scholarship on Augustine since, and yes, there are certain things that I wouldn't say are outdated, but that we know more about, that are much more nuanced in more current scholarship. There was a second edition that was published in 2000 where Peter Brown, in 2 epilogues, actually talks about the things that he left out, but also what more recent scholarship has said, and he kind of responds to that. But still, I think this is an amazing place to begin with Augustine. And, I think for me, I always struggled with Augustine for many years, but the biography really convinced me that he was worth revisiting. And so, yeah, I've reread the Confessions several times since, and, I think he's such an important figure, especially in the period that I study, which is the 16th century. Reformers were very influenced by Augustine, and I think if you want to understand what is unique about Western Christianity, of all of its different forms, I would definitely recommend this biography, and it's just really well written, and just a great reminder that a scholar can also be a good writer. So the next book is another one of these kinds of books, Fiction in the Archives by Natalie Zeman Davis. So I made an entire video about another work by her, The Return of Martin Guerre, which I recommend, but I do think Fiction in the Archives is a stronger work and just much more interesting for me. Fiction in the Archives is all about letters of remission. So in the early modern period, criminals who were facing execution particularly would try to solicit the king for a letter of remission so that their punishment could be remitted. And so they would hire these writers who would write down the story. The criminal will tell the story, trying to explain all the mitigating factors that were involved. So these are people who are guilty of a crime, who admit to their guilt, but are saying, well, look, it's much more complicated, trying to explain their side of things so that the king will give them a letter of remission. And these works were pieces of nonfiction, but they're also literary. And I think what makes this study so important is that when we think about literariness, we should think about fiction, and we think about, someone writing a novel. We don't think about how someone telling their own story is literary, and how these just ordinary people, sometimes peasants, would have to present their own stories in such a way that the king would be convinced to write them a letter of remission. So it's about these scribes who were great storytellers. And now I want to seek out letters of remission and read them and just see how engaging and how convincing these letters are. So I definitely recommend this book. It's also just it's very well written. It's short. And I think there are illustrations in it, so definitely check it out. The next book is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. The New Jim Crow was one of the most important books for me that I've read in the last few years. I didn't really understand the war on drugs and how racist the war of drugs is. Michelle Alexander is a former attorney for the NAACP. The New Jim Crow is about how the war on drugs emerged as a way of targeting Black people in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act. And it's all about all the ways in which states try to get around equality. Now, this is a system that is in place, and so even while people aren't consciously being racist, although that's certainly the case, it's now built into the system that Black people are unfairly targeted on the issue of drugs. And anytime someone challenges that in the Supreme Court, it is tossed out because they say, well, we're colorblind. So, the full title of this book is The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And I think that the title really shows you the dangers of thinking that we are colorblind. It really made me interested in the criminal justice system in America. If you really want to understand anything from the Black Lives Matter to, any of the movements around prison reform, etc., I would definitely recommend this book. It was so well documented, extremely eye-opening for me. So yeah, definitely recommend The New Jim Crow. And then a book that I have mentioned so many times on this channel, The Art of Biblical Narrative by Robert Alter. Robert Alter is a scholar of the Hebrew Scriptures. He has actually produced translations of books in the Hebrew Bible, but it's his book, The Art of Biblical Narrative, that I just found the most eye-opening. As with fiction in the archives, sometimes we ignore the literariness of works of nonfiction or spiritual works or anything like that. And The Art of Biblical Narrative is a reminder that the Bible includes some great stories, and that it's not just about cutting up the books in the Bible like Genesis and saying, okay, this part was written here at this time, this part was written here at this time, but to ask, well, isn't there a redactor who put together all of these stories into the book that we call Genesis? What does that mean? Why these stories? What elements do they have in common? So if you've ever been interested in narrative, which I assume that you are if you're on BookTube, I definitely recommend The Art of Biblical Narrative. It made me read with fresh eyes stories that I thought I knew so well. So yeah, just incredible book. I know that Robert Alter has another book about poetry. I do hope to get to that soon. And the final book, The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. So this is the only book on the list that is historical, that is a classic. Now you could argue that it is a religious work, and in a sense it is, but it isn't explicitly Christian. It's really a work of philosophy, as the title suggests. So Boethius lived in the 6th century, and he was a political man, and actually what prompted him to write this book was being under house arrest, where he was falsely accused of treason and eventually executed brutally. And it's while he's under house arrest that he imagines that Lady Philosophy comes to him and basically tells him to get over himself. But through this work that is a mix of prose and verse, he kind of works through questions of wealth and foreknowledge and human freedom and time and all kinds of different issues. It is beautifully written and just very moving, I think. It's a very humbling work because Lady Philosophy reminds Boethius that he had an incredible amount of privilege. both of his sons were made high officials, and Boethius had it all, and then he lost it. This is where you get the wheel of fortune, right? That fortune is a wheel. At one time you're going up, and then suddenly you're no longer going up. And it's about learning to accept that and to move forward even while fortune is no longer in your favor. There's definitely a Stoic influence in this work, and I think it's very, very beautiful. I read it several times, and now that I'm talking about it, I want to read it again. So maybe I'll do a series on it. Let me know if you'd be interested in that. So yes, that is the tag. Let me know if you've read any of these, and a reminder that next week, next Friday, we will be starting a read-along of a nonfiction work, Communal Luxury by Kristen Ross. We'll be reading the introduction and the first 2 chapters, and the first video will be next Friday. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.